Hello, I'm Alan Guelzo, the Henry R. Luce Professor of the Civil War Era at Gettysburg College and Director of Civil War Era Studies at Gettysburg College. But today I'm not going to be talking about the Civil War. In fact, today I'm not really even going to be talking about American history or Gettysburg College. I'm actually going to be talking about, well, history in general. History broadly conceived. History as it has been written down through the many centuries that history has been a subject for people like me to write. People like me. Like Broccoli and like Wagner, there are just some things that temperamentally you either love or hate. And history, as I've learned from many years as a teacher, is one of those things. On the one hand, there's Henry Ford, who memorably declared that history is bunk. And then there's Napoleon, who dismissed history as a fable agreed upon. And then there's Matthew Arnold, who called history that huge Mississippi of falsehood. And then on the other hand, as I say, there's me. And I suspect you. I have loved this history stuff since I've been old enough to love anything. And as the only child of an only child, I suppose it helped to fill up the vacuums of such a child's life, to be able to people it with those who had been great and powerful and exciting, and above all, real. I suppose it made me a little like Edwin Arlington Robinson's character in his poem, Miniver Cheevy. Miniver loved the days of old, when swords were bright and steeds were prancing. The vision of a warrior bold would send him dancing. Miniver mourned the ripe renown that made so many a name so fragrant. He mourned romance, now on the town, and art, a vagrant. Notice, however, that I've started to fog up what I'm calling history. History is what happened in the past. History is also what Miniver Cheevy read or thought he read in books. Are the two the same thing? Is what we are pursuing some form of experience or empathy with past events? Or is it simply an infatuation with a species of literature, which shares pretty much the same spirit as, well, let's say literary infatuations with Jane Austen or J.K. Rowling? I expect that some of us are quite content to read history for the special pleasure that reading history, as a subset of all reading, can give. And in that case, our pleasure will be heightened by factors which turn out to be extraneous to any particular experience of the past. We'll value an author's style, or will be attracted by its earth-shaking subject. But bear in mind that the charm of an author's style in describing past events has nothing to do with how those events occurred, some of which might have appeared as anything but charming. Nor did most contemporaries of great events have much opportunity to participate in them or even to recognize them as great. So, is our interest in the great events of history, reading about the great events of history, is that some kind of artificial imposition which we make on the past, celebrating, in hindsight, what the actual historical actors would scarcely have noticed? Unlike experiencing history, which we receive passively, writing history leaves you with no alternative but choosing. If you are writing the history book, you must choose from the vast swim of records and evidence that survive the experience of the past and attempt to reconstruct what happened. Now, that means, of course, that you accept a certain amount of choice already having been made for you, because you can only write about a past which has actually left records or evidence. Without them, you have no history book to write any more than a district attorney has a case. But human beings, happily for us history people, tend to scatter records and evidence almost as promiscuously as litter. And this may sound surprising to those of you who think that history is full of unsolved mysteries and unanswered questions. But the truth is that more often than not, the problem of history writing is more like feast than famine. Too many solutions and not enough mysteries. Too many answers and not enough questions. So managing the feast requires action on your part if you're going to write history, not merely passive reception. It requires that you possess, at the very least, some active but subjective qualities like insight or empathy or previous knowledge of such experiences. And as we'll see in a moment, managing the feast may also call out some higher order ideological commitments as well. But on whatever basis you do it, managing the feast of history requires action. It requires choosing. You simply cannot write about everything. You can't even write about everything that took place in a single historical day, much less everything in a single historical event. In fact, you even have to choose what you're going to call an event if you're going to write about it. The storming of the Bastille. Now that looks like a historical event. It's one thing that happens on one day, July 14th, 1789, and it occurs in one place in the Rue Saint-Antoine. So it looks like we finally got an event that we can talk about, that everybody recognizes as a historical event with nice boundaries. But isn't there something that you might feel if you're writing about the fall of the Bastille? Isn't there something you'd like to say about what had happened before July 14th? And elsewhere in Paris? And what happened to the Bastille afterward? Demolition of the Bastille began the day after the storming of the Bastille, but the demolition work actually lasted until November of 1789. So is that part of the event? How long can we say what the time span of an event, even something as discrete as the fall of the Bastille, really is? So you see, writing history begins with choosing. One aspect of that choosing is decided for us in advance by what is capable of being known about an event. The other aspect involves the choice we make about what event and then what aspects of the event that we want to end up focusing on as we write. Now, if all this makes your head swim, then good, because that will nudge you to the question that I want you to ask, and that is this: how have other historians in the past managed this feast, managed this complicated work of choosing, of history writing? How conscious have they been of the temptations to color and adjust, of the need to sort and to choose, and of the inevitability of interpretation? And all the while somehow managing not to surrender to weariness and cynicism about the whole project. Well, that, in large measure, is what this teaching company course is about. It is, so to speak, the history of how great historians have gone about the task of history writing. I now find myself pushed at last to a clear-cut and unavoidable definition of what history writing is. Are you ready? Here it comes. History writing is a humanistic prose narrative of events based upon systematic inquiry into words, deeds, ideas, conflicts, and sufferings which have occurred in the past and which have left verifiable evidentiary trails in the present. That is a long definition. In fact, that's not only long, but that's a very loaded definition. So let me unpack its luggage of all those numerous and heavy adjectives. All right? History is, first of all, humanistic. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that history is focused on what has happened to and happened between human beings. It does not, and it cannot, concern itself with divine providence, the mandate of heaven, the will and personality of God. That's not because history is anti-religious. As we'll see, a great deal of our history writing has been molded by religious questions and religious assumptions. It's simply because the material and methods of religion and history are different. Now, I know this is putting things glibly, because there are bound to be moments when the two intersect. But for the moment at least, this is where we'll leave things. History is humanistic, not out of hostility to religion, but out of concentration on its human material. Secondly, history is prose narrative. You see, history is different from a Homeric epic poem, or even from Shakespeare's history plays, because it's not poetry, and it almost always is not an oral performance, unless you count modern-day audiobooks or maybe even me doing this lecture series. As we'll see in a moment, history's origins may indeed lie very near the recitation of the epic poem or the making of something like a docudrama, but the fundamental difference is that history writing is prose, and that it is a narrative, and its purpose is informing rather than entertaining or even edifying. Even if it does manage to do both of those things, those goals are wholly subsidiary to the goal of informing. Now, a third thing in our definition of history is based upon systematic inquiry. History cannot be confected from the historian's imagination and still be history. It cannot exist without asking questions, without examining and cross-examining, without being concerned to establish that one particular thing happened at one particular time rather than at another. In fact, the word history is itself simply the Greek word for inquiry, histories. And it appears first in that first of all historians, Herodotus, and more of that in the second lecture. Then, unpacking our definition still further, history writing relies on verifiable evidentiary trails. It is this evidence which is the object of the inquiry and becomes the subject of the prose narrative. It cannot be invented, and it cannot be mere hearsay, fable, or myth. Hearsay, fables, and myths are what epics and dramas can incorporate, but not history, which wants to use evidence which can be verified, or returned to and examined by others, or recognized by others as having validity. Now, this is not to say that fables and myths, even hearsay, may not contain elements which have some evidentiary use. The Iliad is an epic poem. That doesn't mean, though, that Troy or Ilium was a figment of Homer's imagination. But history writing, that wants to function on the kind of evidence which one would find in a court of law more than in a novel. So there we have it, our long definition. History writing is a humanistic, prose narrative of events based upon systematic inquiry into words, deeds, ideas, conflicts, and sufferings which occurred in the past and which have left verifiable evidentiary trails in the present. The first question, which I suppose any curious human mind is apt to ask, not just of history, but really about anything that it encounters, is this: what is that? Isn't that really the most basic question of all? What is that? Nothing we encounter in the material world comes with a conveniently inscribed name or description or list of parts, or whether it can be eaten safely. And except for certain pieces of high-tech electronic equipment, even then, the names, descriptions, and parts are pretty well incomprehensible. And what's more, they're in danger of being eaten by small children. But once we've examined things and given them names and drawn diagrams and, who knows, maybe tested their edibility on the dog, then a second question comes along almost as naturally as that first question. And that second question is this: where did it come from? So the first question is, what is it? And the second question is, where did it come from? Two most basic questions the human being is going to answer. Now, what do we mean by that second question? Well, basically what we want to know is, having figured out what the it is in what is it, we then ask, did it arrive yesterday? Did it arrive the day before? Was it someplace else, or has it always been here? Can anyone remember when it was delivered? And it's the moment that we begin to ask this second question that we've really asked the basic question which underlies all the history which has ever been written. History, however, as I've defined it before, was not the first or only way in which this second question was answered. The epic poem was really the first kind of answer to our second question. Where did this come from? And the epic poem appears as the answer to our question as early as 2700 BC in the so-called Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, the question which lies at the base of the Gilgamesh epic is precisely this second question, this question of origins. Where did it come from? The it, in this example, being the Mesopotamian city of Uruk, and how Gilgamesh went through every hardship to build it. Now, in the process, Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, learns a great deal about friendship, about the gods, about women, about the lone immortal man, Utnapishtim, who survived a great universal flood, and the impossibility of escaping death. All that Gilgamesh learns in the course of this epic. So the preponderance of the Epic of Gilgamesh walks us through many of the fundamental mysteries of philosophy and theology and human nature. But in the end, we come back to the real genesis of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the question, where did it come from? It being, in this case, the Sumerian city of Uruk. And it's answered like this. Gilgamesh said to Urshanabi, the ferryman, "Go up, Urshanabi, onto the wall of Uruk and walk around. Examine its foundation. Inspect its brickwork thoroughly. Is not even the core of the brick structure of kiln-fired brick? And did not the 7 sages themselves lay out its plan?" All of that is an answer to the question, where did this come from? Now, there is some evidence that Gilgamesh was not an invented figure, nor was the city of Uruk, which was built at the southern end of the great plain formed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and was one of the first great cities built by the Sumerians, perhaps as early as 3000 BC. Still, if the question is right, the answer is not history. It may have the basic historical question in view, but whatever historical bits are swimming in the brew of the Epic of Gilgamesh are limited to being bits of half-remembered names and the little that was left beside Uruk's great kiln-fired brick walls to explain where Uruk had come from. Another limitation grew from the audience, because indeed the epics were intended to be heard, not read. The epics had to please their listeners, and so the story had to be bent in ways which would offer answers to other questions beside the second question, the historical question. The epics were also expected to awaken admiration for the accomplishments of one's own city, or king, or heroes. And that might require something more elevated than just explaining the architectural skill of the kings or their handiness around a brick kiln. And because the epics were oral, the most complete surviving text of the Gilgamesh epic only dates from about 1200 BC, yet clearly it was circulating orally for centuries before that. Because it was oral, the epic poem, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, was open to editing, shortening, reconstructing, sometimes inventing whole new portions of the epic as the reciters of the epic saw fit. Of Of course, epic poems were not the only way to attempt an answer to the second question, to give an account of the past. And the emphasis here really is on the word account. For as the cities of the Sumerian plain grew and established themselves, they generated two familiar phenomenon of all organized social living: bureaucrats and merchants. And bureaucrats and merchants must have lists. Lists establish legitimacy. If you want to show that you are entitled to govern one of these cities, it will help you enormously if you can produce a list of your ancestors who were also the governors and kings of that city. Lists also establish ownership. Anyone who's ever had to make up a household inventory knows that the principal purpose of the inventory, of that list, is to demonstrate to an insurance company that you really did own that 56-inch flat screen that you're asking to be recompensed for. And anyone who has ever conducted a store inventory knows that the only way to find out if you're showing a profit is to match the as yet unsold goods in your warehouse with what you've already been able to sell. And then there are specialized lists, like tax rolls. Tax rolls enumerate how many taxpayers are available and how much they're paying per capita, depending on what the municipal budget is. And if you are a Sumerian king, census rolls will tell you how many warriors you can call up to conquer a nearby city, or to protect yourself from the depredations of pirates and robber bands. The Sumerians kept property and boundary lists as well. And these proved to be very, very useful in establishing chains of ownership over time, a little bit like title insurance, when treaties between cities had to be written or disputes settled. In fact, property and boundary lists were frequently inscribed onto boundary markers so that there would be no mystery as to what purpose those markers were serving. The so-called vulture stela from about 2500 BC is a boundary stone on which is inscribed a fairly involved account of how Enlil, the chief of the Sumerian gods, set the first boundary between the cities of Lagash and Umma. And then it goes on to explain how Umma invaded Lagash and how Lagash successfully reestablished the boundary. Now, I'm not sure this is the sort of thing which you'd like to take with you for summer vacation reading. What is interesting, though, about the vulture stela is how this list of events determining a boundary also begins to show traces of a new quality: interpretation. The king of Umma, or Lama, sets off this struggle by draining a boundary canal. But the stela goes on to add that Ur-Lama also destroyed the shrines of the gods, a detail which is perfectly extraneous to the draining of boundary canals, but which is really useful for putting Ur-Lama in a bad light. The stela also explains that Ur-Lama is as puffed up as the mountains. So we move from merely reciting tit for tat over a boundary canal. We're now identifying a character trait in one of the protagonists, which casts this boundary controversy as a good guy versus bad guy affair. Now, linked to the production of lists, we've been answering our second question, our question of where something came. Why is it here? We've been linking all of that together, moving from epic poems to lists, even to boundary stones. Those, in turn, are linked to the production of annals. And annals are what we begin to receive from the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians as they begin to vie for empire in the ancient Near East. It's in these annals that we begin to see the first consistent glimmerings, not so much of inquiry, as a desire to anticipate, or maybe even stimulate inquiry. Like lists, annals serve an official purpose. They record the activities of a pharaoh, of a king, or an emperor strutting across the public stage. Now, in some cases, these annals barely rise above being lists. They become annals or lists of battles, of conquests, of numbers of slaves captured, of numbers of cities leveled, of numbers of captives put to death in imaginatively unpleasant ways. But in other examples of these annals, another more plaintive purpose peeps out. And that is the monarch's desire to be remembered for what he has done. There is usually a measure of self-interest in wanting to be thus remembered, especially if the annals contain exhortations to make offerings on behalf of the dead ruler. But what marks the annals of the kings, from the Egyptian pharaohs to the kings of Babylon, is the desire to record events of such magnitude and accomplishment that readers, centuries later, will nevertheless, despite the passage of time, feel that that pharaoh or king has some kind of claim, even then, on their sympathies. There is one last overture to the appearance of history in the ancient Near East, and that comes to us from the Hebrews, a people who not only defined their nationality by a single historical event, the Exodus from Egypt under Moses, but who insisted on casting most of their sacred writings into the form of annals or chronicles of their judges and kings. The Hebrews were not only interested in the events of the past, their beliefs were anchored to the incontestable witness of real historical events. The earliest example of what we can call a profession of Hebrew faith comes in the form of a historical statement in Deuteronomy 26, and it runs like this. Then you shall declare before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramaean, and he went down into Egypt with a few people and lived there and became a great nation, powerful and numerous. But the Egyptians mistreated us and made us suffer, putting us to hard labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our misery, toil, and oppression. So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with great terror and miraculous signs and wonders. That is remarkable. This is the appeal of a people for their identity to history. And they supplied generous helpings of historical interpretation within their annals, their chronicles, to explain the ups and downs of their kings. Sometimes what explains the ups and downs of a king is idolatry. That's what causes Jeroboam's hand to wither. Adultery, that almost destroys David. Greed, which marks out Ahab as the axis of evil. And other kinds of moral offenses. See, for the Hebrews, history is not merely a description of one event after another. And more than even offering interpretation, the Hebrew chronicles talk about causation, and in terms that human beings can understand and apply and profit from. Most surprising of all, the Hebrews were quite conscious of the varieties of evidence they were choosing from. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, asks the chronicler of 1 Kings chapter 11, are they not written in the book of the Annals of Solomon? Well, what the Annals of Solomon was, we have no idea. What's clear, though, is that the chronicler did. And he chose not to use them in his own writing. So choice. We are now beginning to see a picture come together of those constituent points. So finally, we are close to having history. But not yet. Not until the Greeks, and not until Herodotus.